But I think what there is now is a degree of uncertainty about what the administration does next. If it seeks to rebuild the tariff wall that has essentially been invalidated by the court's ruling yesterday, what kind of uncertainty does that inject into the system? What kind of complexity will companies face?
Let's turn to the other big story this morning, turmoil over tariffs. Last night, President Trump announced a new 10% levy on all imports to the US, hours after the Supreme Court struck down his larger set of tariffs known as Liberation Day. They ruled that was illegal. President Trump made his displeasure very clear.
Deeply disappointing, and I'm ashamed of certain members of the court for not having the courage to do what's right for our country. Foreign countries that have been ripping us off for years are ecstatic. They're dancing in the streets, but they won't be dancing for long.
So what is this going to mean for British exporters to the United States? And is there any prospect of a refund on those tariffs already paid? Andrew Wilson is Deputy General Secretary of the International Chamber of Commerce, which represents 40 million businesses around the world. Morning, Andrew.
Good morning.
Your reaction to this Supreme Court ruling first?
Look, I think there are many ways to slice and dice what is a very important ruling, no doubt about that. But I think the most pragmatic way to look at this from a business perspective is what were businesses expecting or hoping for from the Supreme Court? And really that boils down to two things, plain and simple. Is there a clear pathway to obtain refunds on the duties that have been paid over the past year or so? And the answer there is very clearly there isn't. And second, I think there was a widespread hope or a degree of anticipation that this may encourage the administration to abandon or at least soft pedal on its tariff-first trade policy. And again, I think what we've seen from the president himself and members of his administration is the intention very clearly is to continue to apply tariffs. So I think it's a very worrying sign for the global economy.
And of course, President Trump has now announced this 10% global tariff. In fact, a deal that predominantly Britain was on anyway. There were some different sectors that had higher tariffs, but that was something Britain fought so hard for, and particularly compared to other nations, at one point looked like a pretty good deal. Do you think that was wasted effort on Britain's part to try and carve out that deal?
No, I certainly don't. And parts of the UK deal with sectors that are subject to tariffs that remain in force, regardless of this judgment, the Section 232 tariffs on products like steel, aluminium, automobiles, etc. So I think we shouldn't discount the importance of the deal that the UK struck, and we wouldn't expect any countries, including the United Kingdom, to walk away from those deals that were hard won in recent months. But I think what there is now is a degree of uncertainty about what the administration does next. If it seeks to rebuild the tariff wall that has essentially been invalidated by the court's ruling yesterday, what kind of uncertainty does that inject into the system? What kind of complexity will companies face? And ultimately, will that require some kind of rethink of the deals, including the UK deal, that have been struck in recent months?
Do you fully expect businesses to get refunds on the tariffs they've paid?
That's unclear, and I think there are 3 points of very significant uncertainty. One, does the administration accept that refunds are due? That's not clear. Second, what is the administrative procedure for companies to file for those refunds, and how quickly will those be administered? Again, we don't have any guidance right now. And then the third thing is many companies that have paid the tariffs will not be eligible to actually claim refunds because they won't be recorded with US Customs as the importer of record. So we foresee the potential for a lot of difficult commercial discussions, but also some potentially messy litigation, even if there is clarity on eligibility and the administrative process for any refunds in the future.
So this potentially could take a very long time. It could be very costly. Would it be better just to write it off, to move on, to accept that that has now been paid, but going forward it's a new regime which will be less costly?
I think you can say that. I mean, we've spoken to many companies in recent months who have had their balance sheets severely strained by the impact of the tariffs, many of which have been pegged at a pretty punitive level. JP Morgan Chase, I think just last week, showed the impact that the tariffs have had on mid-sized companies in the US in particular. So I don't think it's an easy equation just to walk away from the refunds. Some companies may ultimately decide to. And I think as well, we should be careful not to assume we're now heading into a regime where there are lower tariffs on imports into the US. The administration has been very clear they're going to look to rebuild this through a variety of sectoral and country level measures. So we could end up, as I think the president indicated in his news conference last night, with a higher effective tariff rate and ultimately a more complex tariff regime that could be severely damaging for international commerce.
You talk about damage. How damaging is this unpredictability of trying to second guess what President Trump is going to do at any given time?
And that's the key question. And when we talk to business leaders across our network, the tariffs are one thing that can be difficult to navigate. Obviously, they have an impact on corporate balance sheets, but at least you can understand what you need to pay if the measures are certain and legally durable. What we see very clearly is the uncertainty that is being cast over international trade, but the global economy more broadly as a result of the US administration's actions is delaying hiring decisions by corporates, delaying investment decisions. And if you don't know what the effective tariff rate in the US is going to be tomorrow, let alone next month, let alone next year, it's very difficult to forward plan and make major decisions about the future of your business. So I think the uncertainty is absolutely crippling. And I think an important message to the US is the more they can do to resolve that uncertainty and bring clarity to businesses and international trade flows one way or another, the better off the US economy will be in terms of job creation, growth, and also consumer welfare.
And what are companies you work with saying about, well, those companies that have decided, for example, to relocate to the USA to try and get round the tariffs to invest in the US? Have their decisions been altered by this? Is that unpredictability causing them to give it a second thought?
So I think there have been a lot of obviously announcements of companies anticipating investing in the US or reshoring their production. How much of that has actually actualized in the real economy, I think, is an open question. I think you have to differentiate between public pronouncements or aspirations, often driven by political pressure, and what's happening. And what businesses tell us very clearly is if there is not policy stability and clarity, if you don't know what the tariff rate is going to be next year or under a future US administration, how can you make an investment decision that's going to take 10 years or even 20 years to pay off in some cases? So the uncertainty by design, which has been the hallmark of this administration, is in fact a clear break on investment into the US and on delivering on its objectives to reboot US manufacturing capacity.
Andrew Wilson, thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you.
Deputy General Secretary there of the International Chamber of Commerce, which represents 40 million businesses around the world.